Hey everyone! Before we dive into today's story, I have to ask, where are you watching from? Maybe New York, or Chicago, or somewhere sunny in Florida? I'd love to know. And if you enjoy this story, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It really helps us reach more people and share these moments together. Alright, now, let me tell you about the day my doctor's neighbor stopped in, and how his story completely caught me by surprise and made me smile in a way I hadn't expected. I had just finished my routine checkup that morning. Nothing out of the ordinary, the usual chit-chat with Dr. Reynolds, his calm presence always putting me at ease. The waiting room was quiet, the faint smell of disinfectant mixed with the faint aroma of coffee from a small machine in the corner. I had just paid my bill and was heading for the door when I noticed him, standing just outside the clinic, leaning casually against his car. I had never seen him before, though he was Dr. Reynolds' neighbor. He looked slightly older than my doctor, perhaps in his late 50s, with a gentle way about him, the kind of demeanor that made people instantly feel safe. His eyes caught mine as I stepped onto the sidewalk, and for a brief moment I hesitated. Something about his presence felt oddly familiar, as though we were characters in the same small, quiet neighborhood story I'd never noticed before. "Hi, I'm Thomas," he said with a friendly smile. "I live next door to Dr. Reynolds. I hope I'm not interrupting." I laughed lightly, a little surprised. Not at all. I just had my appointment, and I was about to head home. There was a pause, comfortable in its simplicity, and then he spoke again. "I didn't want to just walk by without saying hello. Dr. Reynolds always mentions the people he meets here, says it keeps his day interesting." That simple comment somehow felt more intimate than he likely intended. It was a small window into the life of someone I only knew as my doctor, a life connected to another person right next door. And in that moment, the ordinary sidewalk seemed a little warmer, a little more inviting. We ended up walking together toward the corner cafe a block away. The sun was gentle that morning, casting long shadows across the pavement, and I noticed the details I usually overlooked, the way the leaves fluttered in the breeze, the subtle scent of baked bread from the cafe, the quiet hum of the city just waking up. Thomas talked in a slow, measured way, not in a rush, like he wanted each word to land where it could. He told me about his garden, how he tended to the roses his late wife had loved, and how he had recently started volunteering at a local community center. Every story seemed to carry a soft undercurrent of care and thoughtfulness. I found myself sharing things too, things I hadn't planned to, about my work, my weekend routines, even the little joys of my mornings spent reading by the window with a cup of tea. It was one of those rare encounters where conversation flows effortlessly, where the silences aren't awkward but comforting. And all the while, I could feel a subtle warmth growing, not romantic exactly, but the kind of connection that makes you feel seen, appreciated, and unexpectedly understood. By the time we reached the cafe, Thomas suggested we grab a seat outside, where the morning sun was gentle on our backs, and the street carried the soft murmur of people beginning their day. We ordered coffee, and he began to tell me a story about how he had recently taken up amateur photography. Not just snapshots, but capturing moments that felt alive, moments that told a story about life itself. What struck me most wasn't just the story, but the way he told it. His hands moved slightly as he spoke, tracing invisible lines in the air, as if painting the images with motion. His voice held a quiet joy that seemed to infect the small space around us. I realized that this encounter, brief as it might have seemed to anyone else, had already brightened my morning in a way I hadn't expected. I laughed at a few of his humorous mishaps, the time he accidentally left his camera in the freezer, thinking it was the kitchen timer, or the way he got hopelessly lost in his own neighborhood while chasing the perfect sunrise. And each laugh felt easy, natural, like a gentle release of tension I didn't know I'd been holding on to. By the time our coffees were finished, I noticed that more than an hour had passed. The sidewalk now felt alive with activity. The bakery door opening and closing, the chatter of neighbors greeting each other, the distant hum of traffic, but in a way that seemed brighter, friendlier, because of this unexpected morning connection. As we stood to leave, Thomas smiled and said, "I hope we can do this again sometime. There's something special about starting the day with a story that makes you smile." I nodded, feeling an unspoken truth in his words. "I'd like that," I said, and meant it. Walking back to my car, I realized how rare and wonderful it is to meet someone who can unexpectedly touch your day with warmth and shared humanity. Something about the way he listened, the way he laughed, and the way he simply existed alongside me in those small moments had created a memory I knew I would return to, like a favorite song on a quiet evening. I never expected that a neighbor of my doctor's could leave such an impression, but in that ordinary morning, with ordinary coffee and ordinary conversation, I discovered that sometimes the simplest encounters can hold the most profound surprises. And as I drove home, I found myself smiling for no reason at all, feeling lighter, quietly grateful for the story that Thomas had brought into my morning. A few days passed after that morning with Thomas, and I couldn't stop thinking about our conversation. It was odd, really, how a simple encounter could linger in your mind like the scent of fresh coffee long after you've left the café. I found myself replaying his stories, imagining him tending his garden, his hands gently brushing against rose petals, and I realized I wanted to see that world up close. Not in any dramatic sense, just to witness the quiet joy he carried with him, the way someone could live fully in the little things. I had been feeling a little restless lately, the kind of restlessness that sneaks up on you in your 40s and 50s. Life's routines can feel safe, yes, but also strangely isolating if you aren't careful. That's why Thomas's visit and his stories resonated so deeply. They reminded me that connection could appear in unexpected ways, and that opening yourself to it didn't require grand gestures, just presence. One morning, I decided to take a walk through my neighborhood, partly to clear my head and partly because I hoped I might run into Thomas again. The air was crisp, carrying the faint tang of autumn leaves beginning to turn. Sunlight spilled across the sidewalks in golden streams, highlighting the familiar shapes of the trees I'd passed 1,000 times but never really looked at. And then, as if drawn by some quiet coincidence, I saw him across the street, tending to his garden. He looked up, surprised but pleased to see me. "I didn't expect company today," he said, his voice warm but casual. "I thought I'd come see what all the fuss is about," I replied, laughing softly. He gestured toward a small bench near the garden gate, the paint a little chipped but charming in its simplicity. "Sit with me," he said, and so I did, and just like that, I was drawn into his world. Thomas's garden was a reflection of him, carefully tended, full of surprises, and yet somehow effortlessly alive. Roses climbed along trellises, their petals in shades I hadn't realized could exist in one garden. Sunflowers swayed gently at the edge, their faces bright against the soft blue sky. He showed me the small patches of vegetables he was growing, telling me about the careful rotation of crops, the joy of pulling ripe tomatoes from the vine. There was a rhythm to it, a quiet order that contrasted sharply with the rush of the city just blocks away. As we walked along the paths, I asked him about his life, and he shared stories I could never have imagined. Stories of travels he had taken with his late wife, of lessons learned in volunteer work, of the small but meaningful ways he tried to leave the world a little better than he found it. Each story carried an honesty that was refreshing, the kind of candidness that made you trust someone immediately. I shared some stories of my own, about my work, about my family, about the little victories and setbacks of everyday life. For once, it didn't feel like I was oversharing. It felt like conversation, a meeting of minds and hearts in the quiet of a sunny garden. There was a rhythm to it, a gentle give and take, where each revelation from him prompted a reflection from me, and each laugh we shared seemed to make the garden itself a little brighter. At one point, we sat on the bench and just watched the world move around us. The neighbor walking his dog, the distant hum of traffic, the flutter of a bird landing on a branch overhead. Thomas broke the silence with a story about a tree in this very garden that had been planted decades ago by someone long gone, yet still stood tall and steadfast. He said it reminded him that life is often about small, consistent acts that leave a legacy, even when we're not looking. I nodded, feeling a lump in my throat, though I wasn't sure why. There was something deeply comforting about his words, the way they seemed to mirror thoughts I hadn't yet put into words myself. I realized that this connection, this unexpected friendship, was teaching me something I hadn't realized I needed to learn, that life could still surprise you, even in your 40s or 50s, and that openness to others could create moments of quiet joy and reflection. We lingered in the garden until late afternoon, the sunlight shifting and warming the air. As I finally rose to leave, Thomas walked me to the gate. "I'm glad you stopped by," he said simply, as though that phrase contained a universe of meaning. I smiled, feeling the same warmth I had felt that first morning. "Me too," I replied, and in that brief exchange, I understood that life had a way of offering these little gifts when you least expected them, if only you were willing to notice. Walking back to my car, I realized how much that morning had changed me. Not in any dramatic or outwardly visible way, but inside. I felt lighter, more open, and somehow more connected to the world around me. I thought about Thomas, about his garden, about the stories he had shared, and I knew I would carry that quiet joy with me, tucked carefully into my daily life, waiting to be revisited whenever I needed it most. It was strange, but wonderful, to discover that someone you barely know could touch your heart so deeply, simply by sharing their world, and that sometimes the most meaningful connections are the ones that arrive without warning, softly, like sunlight spilling across a quiet street. The days grew shorter as autumn deepened, and I found myself thinking more and more about Thomas. I realized that the quiet mornings we had spent together, the sidewalk conversation, the stroll through his garden, had left a small but steady glow in my day-to-day life. There was something about his presence that made ordinary things feel extraordinary, and I began to notice little details I had long taken for granted: the crispness of the morning air, the way sunlight filtered through the leaves, the simple pleasure of sitting quietly with a cup of tea. One Saturday morning, I decided to take a longer walk, hoping to stumble upon Thomas again, though I didn't want to seem intrusive. As I approached his street, I noticed that the leaves had begun to fall in earnest, carpeting the sidewalks in shades of amber and gold. He was outside, sweeping the path in front of his house, the rake moving in slow, deliberate strokes. "Good morning," I called out as I approached, and he looked up, smiling warmly. "Morning," he replied. "Care to help? I promise it's not as tedious as it looks." I laughed and grabbed a rake from the pile he had set aside. There was a rhythm to the work that was soothing, the swish of leaves moving across the pavement, the gentle effort of bending and lifting, the shared silence punctuated by occasional observations about the weather or a particularly stubborn leaf. In those moments, I felt a profound sense of ease, the kind of connection that doesn't need words to exist. As we worked, Thomas began telling me more stories, this time about his family. He spoke of his children, grown now, scattered across the country, and the bittersweet joy of watching them thrive from a distance. He talked about the challenges he had faced, the moments of grief after his wife's passing, and the ways he had learned to find light in the smallest corners of life. His voice was calm but layered with emotion, and I realized I was holding my breath, not wanting to miss a single word. I shared a little of my own life too, not just the everyday routines, but the hopes and doubts I sometimes kept to myself. And as I spoke, I noticed something shifting inside me. There was no judgment here, no need to perform or impress. There was simply understanding, the kind that comes from two people recognizing the fragility and beauty of life in one another's company. After a while, We took a break and sat on the low stone wall bordering his yard. The sun had risen higher, spilling warmth across the street, and a gentle breeze carried the crisp scent of autumn leaves. Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn notebook. "I've been keeping notes," he said, "little observations, small stories, thoughts about the day. It helps me remember the ordinary moments that are actually quite extraordinary." He handed me the notebook, and I turned the pages, surprised by the care and detail he had poured into it. Each entry was simple but vivid: memories of a walk through the park, a conversation with a neighbor, the sight of a bird perched on a branch. And yet, reading them, I felt a sense of intimacy, as though he had invited me into the quiet corners of his world. "I like how you notice things," I said softly. "It's inspiring." He shrugged, a modest gesture, but his eyes held a warmth that made me smile. "I suppose I've learned that life doesn't have to be grand to be meaningful. It's in the small things, the everyday gestures, the people who touch your day without even realizing it." We spent the rest of the morning tending to the garden and chatting, the hours slipping by unnoticed. There was a rhythm to our time together, a gentle ebb and flow that felt both comforting and invigorating. By the time I stood to leave, the sun had moved toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard and painting everything in a golden glow. "I'm glad we did this," Thomas said, his voice quiet but steady. "It feels good to share these moments." "I feel the same," I replied, and realized that my heart carried a lightness I hadn't felt in months, maybe even years. There was a growing sense of trust and companionship between us, something subtle but profound, the kind of bond that forms quietly, through shared stories, laughter, and simple presence. As I walked back to my car, leaves crunching underfoot, I reflected on how these moments had changed me. They had taught me to pay attention, to slow down, and to appreciate the beauty in the everyday. And most importantly, they had shown me that connection doesn't need to be loud or dramatic. It can be quiet, patient, and unwavering, and yet still leave a lasting impression on your heart. That evening, as I made my way home and settled into my favorite chair with a cup of tea, I thought about Thomas, his garden, his notebook, and the laughter we had shared. I realized that some people enter your life not to stay forever, but to remind you of something you might have forgotten: how to see the world with fresh eyes, how to appreciate the small joys, and how to allow yourself to feel genuinely seen. I didn't know where this connection with Thomas might lead, and I didn't need to. For now, the simple act of knowing he was there, and that our lives had intersected in such a meaningful way, was enough. And as I sipped my tea and watched the autumn leaves dance outside my window, I felt a quiet sense of gratitude, a gentle warmth that I knew I would carry with me always. The first frost had arrived that morning, painting the edges of leaves and rooftops with a delicate shimmer. I stepped outside, wrapped in a warm scarf, and felt that familiar tug of anticipation in my chest, the kind I had come to associate with visits to Thomas's world. There was something grounding about our time together, something that made ordinary days feel extraordinary, and I wanted to hold onto it a little longer before winter took hold. I walked down the quiet street, my footsteps muffled by the fallen leaves, and spotted him across the way, tending to his garden despite the chill. He looked up, saw me, and waved with that same gentle smile that had first caught my attention weeks ago. "Good morning," he called, his voice carrying across the crisp air. "Good morning," I replied, smiling as I approached. There was a calm rhythm to our greeting now, a comfort that comes from repeated connection. I noticed the way he moved with care, brushing frost from the tips of his roses and checking each plant as if it were a friend. We spent the morning together, as we often did, working quietly and sharing stories. But today there was a sense of reflection in our conversation, a mutual acknowledgement of how much these simple moments had meant to each of us. Thomas shared memories of his wife, recounting stories of their travels and everyday life, and I realized that he was letting me into parts of his world he hadn't shared with anyone in years. There was a trust there that touched me deeply. I shared my own reflections as well, about how these encounters had changed my perspective, about the gratitude I felt for the little joys and connections that often go unnoticed. We talked about the passage of time, the small regrets we each carried, and the ways in which unexpected friendships could heal and illuminate parts of life we thought were long forgotten. At one point, we paused to watch a small flock of birds settle in a nearby tree. The frost on the branches caught the sunlight, and the moment felt suspended in time, a quiet reminder of the beauty in the world when you simply take the time to notice it. "I never thought a simple conversation could mean so much," I said softly. Thomas nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "Sometimes the smallest connections leave the biggest mark. We don't always realize it at the moment, but later, it becomes part of who we are." I felt the truth of his words deeply. There was a sense of clarity that came with this friendship, a gentle understanding that life could still surprise us, even in ways we didn't anticipate. And in that clarity, I realized that these moments weren't just memories to cherish. They were lessons in presence, in appreciation, in living fully in the quiet corners of life. By the time the sun had climbed higher, our time together was drawing to a close. Thomas walked me to the gate, and we exchanged a quiet, knowing smile. "Thank you," I said, my voice carrying a warmth I couldn't fully put into words. "For what?" he asked gently. "For everything," I replied. "For showing me that life can still surprise me, for reminding me to pay attention, and for letting me be part of your world." He looked at me, and in that moment, I saw a reflection of my own feelings mirrored in his eyes. "The feeling is mutual," he said simply. I walked back home, the frost crunching underfoot, and felt a sense of peace I hadn't realized I was missing. There was no dramatic ending to our story, no sudden revelation or grand gesture, just connection, understanding, and the quiet joy of shared moments. And that, I realized, was enough. That evening, I sat by my window with a cup of tea, watching the frost glisten on the trees. I thought about Thomas, about the mornings we had shared, and about the subtle ways life had reminded me of its beauty. I understood now that sometimes the most meaningful experiences come not from planned events or extraordinary circumstances, but from the simple act of being present with another person, of listening, and of noticing. I smiled to myself, feeling lighter and more open than I had in a long time. Life had a way of bringing people together in unexpected ways, and sometimes all it took was a kind presence, a shared story, and the courage to embrace small, quiet moments. And as I sipped my tea and watched the first evening frost begin to melt in the fading sunlight, I felt a quiet gratitude for that ordinary morning that had turned into something extraordinary, a reminder that connection, understanding, and mutual respect could create memories that stay with you long after the day has ended.